One framework grew 863% over the last 6 months. Another one in the same category grew 18%. Last October, I made a video comparing 3 spec-driven development frameworks: BMAD, Spec Kit, and OpenSpec. Later, I covered Taskmaster and Agent OS in separate videos. 86,000 of you watched the first one. The combined GitHub stars of those 5 jumped from around 87,000 to 202,000, plus 131% in 6 months. This part isn't the interesting number. The interesting number is the spread. Inside that same average, one framework ran away with it, while another stalled. One rewrote itself from scratch, and one quietly shrank its own scope. Spec-driven development gained momentum over the last 6 months, partly because the tools got better, partly because of marketing. This video is the 6-month update: what changed, who won, who stalled, and what the rest of the community has been saying. No hands-on retest this time. That's a separate one coming later. OpenSpec grew from 4,100 stars in October to 39,500 now, plus 863% in 6 months, the runaway story of the last half year. Honestly, back when I first compared the 3 frameworks, I recommended Spec Kit. What actually changed my mind wasn't the V1 release, it was what happened after I published the video. I kept using both OpenSpec and Spec Kit on real work, and over a few weeks it became obvious OpenSpec was producing the same quality, just much faster. Spec Kit was simply too slow to plan. So I dropped Spec Kit and stuck with OpenSpec. Then, and this is where it gets interesting, I eventually dropped OpenSpec. Claude Code's built-in plan mode started covering most of what I needed for day-to-day work, and Superpowers handled the bigger features. OpenSpec didn't do anything wrong, the native tooling just caught up. The growth numbers suggest a lot of other people went through some version of the same funnel, which is part of why OpenSpec, the lightest weight framework in the set, came out on top. A lot changed on their side. The V1 release is a significant rewrite: smaller output, clearer structure, less markdown sprawl. The team also joined Y Combinator's Winter 26 batch and expanded tool compatibility to more than 25 agents and IDEs. The community coverage matches the numbers. Augment Code's ranking has it at number 4 out of 6, but Augment Code's own product is ranked number 1 in the same list, so I wouldn't weight that placement too heavily. Rick Hightower's piece consistently calls out OpenSpec as the lightest ceremony option of the 4 he compared. My own take: lightweight beats heavy when the frontier model is already doing most of the implementation work. A small disclosure: a lot of people at Toggle, where I work, use OpenSpec as their framework of choice. A couple of enthusiasts even built an internal UI wrapper around it, essentially a Kanban-style board for OpenSpec workflows. So factor that in. I have a biased sample of one engineering organization. Stars aren't a perfect metrics either. YC cohorts and Hacker News spikes can choose them. But plus 863% is a lot, and that's one's public, not mine to manipulate. My honest take? If you're coming to spec-driven development for the first time, OpenSpec is where I'd start. It's fast, it won't bury you in Markdown before you write any code, and the community around it is growing faster than any of the original 5 I'm covering today. That doesn't mean it's the right fit for every team. BMAD's fans will tell you otherwise, and they have a point too. But as a default starting position for a new team exploring the space, OpenSpec is the one I'd hand somebody first. BMAD went from 19,100 stars to 44,400, plus 133%, which tracks with the rest of the market growth but doesn't lead it. The interesting thing here isn't the raw number, it's what they're shipping along the way. Version 6 shipped back in February. V6.0.0 came out on February 17th, and they've been pushing point releases ever since. V6.3 is from early April. The stable 6 release was essentially a ground-up rewrite. They consolidated several older agents into a single persona called Amelia, introduced what they call a skills architecture, and shipped a cross-platform agent team that works across more than 20 agent runtimes. 12 plus specialized agent personas are available. On top of that, the team spun out BMAD Builder as its own project for building custom agents and workflows. It's at v1.4 already. DevLoop automation is another piece of the ecosystem. There is also a small marketplace of community-contributed skills. That's a lot of surface area. Community reception is mostly positive on the technical side. On the critical side, the most common complaint is the ceremony itself, the number of markdown files per spec, the full PM to developer handoff rituals, and a PRD phase that asks you to define business success metrics for a weekend project. That's the trade-off BMAD has always made. And by the way, no wonder so many BMAD fans showed up in the comments of my last video to defend it. The community around this one runs hot. BMAD has one of the most active communities on this leaderboard. Their Discord usually has close to 2,000 people online at any given time, which is generally a lot for a framework this specialized. I'm not going to claim it's literally the biggest without doing a headcount across every project, but it's almost the most active easily. Quick disclosure on my own side. I did retest BMAD v6 fairly recently, the full 4-phase flow, which is the actual ceremony, planning, solutioning, implementation, all of it. The results weren't great. 7 hours to build a cat game I could build in 10 minutes with plan mode. I have a separate video on that whole experience linked below. A fair number of viewers in the comments made a point worth repeating. BMAD is designed for bigger project scopes, and a smaller test project doesn't let it show what it can actually do. That's a legitimate critique. I'm not going to rerun the full 4-phase ceremony on a bigger project though, that would cost me another 8 to 20 hours and I'd rather keep my weekends. What I do want to retest is party mode and quick flow on a larger scope and see whether the lighter touch modes hold up better than the heavy one did. That'll be its own video. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss it. My honest take? BMAD isn't really a team tool. I don't think for teams is even the right framing. What kind of team is this where each member orchestrates their own nested squad of virtual PM, architect, and developer agents? BMAD is for individual builders who genuinely want the full agile ritual layered on top of their AI coding setup. Solo devs, serious 5 coders, agent orchestrators, whatever we are calling them this month. If you like structured multi-agent workflows and don't mind reading spec documents, this is the one. If you want to ship quickly, probably not. Spec Kit grew from 39,300 stars to 87,500, plus 123%. That's a huge raw number, almost 50,000 new stars. And it puts Spec Kit at the top of the leaderboard in absolute stars by a comfortable margin. What GitHub shipped? 136 releases since October, support for more than 14 AI agent platforms, Claude Code, Cursor, Windsurf, Copilot, and a long tail of smaller agents. Microsoft also published an official Spec Kit training module on Microsoft Learn. Other SDD frameworks have courses on platforms like Udemy, sure, but a Microsoft Learn module signals something different in an enterprise context. The creator, Dan Delamarski, also left Microsoft, where he built Spec Kit as a GitHub project, for Anthropic along the way. Could be read as a founder leaving the project, could be read as a vote of confidence in where AI assistant development is going more broadly. Probably a bit of both. Community reception is mixed. Martin Fowler's analysis of Spec Kit was the sharpest critique in the space. His observation: Spec Kit generates 8 plus markdown files per spec, and in his words, those were files repetitive, verbose, and tedious to review. His closer, and this is verbatim, was "I'd rather review code than all these markdown files." He also noted that agents frequently ignored the instructions in those specs. Augment Code's ranking puts Spec Kit at number 3 out of 6. Rick Hightower's comparison describes it as middle ground execution. It executes through the connected AI, but it doesn't manage parallelism the way frameworks like GSD do. My honest take? Spec Kit is faster than BMAD. It's also noticeably slower than OpenSpec. The difference isn't really about structure. When I ran Spec Kit back in October, the output quality felt about the same as OpenSpec's, just arriving inside a much larger pile of markdown. And that plan phase, I remember it took around 5 minutes just to complete planning, which felt incredibly slow compared to OpenSpec finishing the same step in a fraction of the time. My instinct, and I'll be upfront, this is instinct, not a proven claim, is that a meaningful chunk of Spec Kit's growth comes from GitHub's brand and Microsoft Learn module, not from the product being the best on merit. I'd love to see some real-world comparisons that confirm or deny that. Remember the thesis from the hook. Momentum from actual tools, momentum from marketing. Spec Kit is probably where the marketing side of that shows up most clearly. If you're considering Spec Kit, test it yourself against OpenSpec on a real task before committing a team to it. Go in with eyes open about what you're buying. Agent OS went from roughly 2,500 stars to 4,300, about plus 72%, which sounds healthy in isolation, but in a market that more than doubled, it is the slowest growth story on the leaderboard. And the repository activity tells you why. The last release, version 3, shipped on January 20th, which was 3 months ago, and there has been nothing since. For comparison, Spec Kit has shipped around 40 releases in the same 3 months. BMAD ships weekly to biweekly, OpenSpec ships weekly, and even Taskmaster manages a release every few weeks. Agent OS has gone completely quiet. In practical terms, the project looks abandoned. What did ship was version 3, and this is the interesting part. V3 was an explicit public downsizing of the framework. The creator, Brian Castle, was direct about the reason in his changelog. Frontier models, which is the industry's term for the large models like Claude and GPT that sit on top of the capability curve, now handle a lot of what earlier Agent OS versions were built to handle. Spec writing, task breakdown, implementation, orchestration, all of it. So V3 intentionally retired those phases and refocused the framework on what Castle calls its core strength, establishing and injecting standards. The V3 comments reflect that. Discover standard, inject standards, index standards, shape spec, and plan product. 5 commands, narrow scope, clear purpose. Community coverage is thin. If you go looking for Agent OS in the comparison pieces, Rick Hightower, Augment Code, Vishal Misur's map of 30 plus frameworks, it mostly gets a brief mention. It's no longer one of the frameworks people are actively comparing. Now my honest take, and this is where I want to be careful. The headline question I had going in was, what does Agent OS actually give me in 2026 that Claude.md files and Claude Code's built-in skills and plan mode don't already provide? Standards enforcement used to be something you needed a dedicated framework for. Now the coding tool itself handles a lot of it, but reading Castle's V3 rationale, the steelman is actually reasonable. Agent OS isn't trying to replace plan mode, it's trying to layer on top of it by making standards discovery and injection more automatic. Inject standards can bake your rules into Claude skills, subagents, or any prompt, which is genuinely more sophisticated than pasting them into a Claude.md file by hand. So there's a real value proposition if standards automation is specifically what you need. Whether that's worth adopting a whole framework for, given that the project hasn't pushed a release in 3 months, that's the question I'd weigh carefully. If you're using V3 and it's working for you, drop a comment. I genuinely like to hear from people it's clicking for. And one thing I'll say for Castle, shipping a smaller V3 instead of pretending the tool still does what it used to do is respectable. Not every maintainer would make that call. Taskmaster went from 22,500 stars to 26,500, plus 18%. In a market where the average framework grew more than 100%, plus 18 is effectively going backwards. And this is the one that surprised me most on the leaderboard, because 6 months ago Taskmaster was arguably the most convenient framework of the set. What happened? A few things in combination. The project moved from the original repository into a dedicated one. The team launched a commercial layer called Hamster over at tryhamster.com, a paid offering built around the same task decomposition engine. The license on the open source side is MIT plus a commons clause writer, which restricts commercial resale. That has been the case for a while. Taskmaster wasn't pure MIT to begin with. But it's worth noting that among all the frameworks on this leaderboard, Taskmaster is the only one that isn't pure MIT. Around the same period, the community also raised concerns about Sentry telemetry calls getting shipped on by default with an opt-out rather than opt-in. Release cadence also slowed. Taskmaster ships roughly every few weeks now, closer to monthly than weekly. Community coverage is still positive on the technical side. Rick Hightower's comparison explicitly says Taskmaster shines at the decomposition layer, turning product requirement documents into dependency-aware task graphs. That part of the tool really does work well. The results Taskmaster produces are, in my experience back when I tested it, genuinely good. The engine is solid. My honest take? When I used Taskmaster 6 months ago, I thought it was the most convenient of the frameworks I tried, and the code it produced was actually good. I want to be fair to the tool because the output was not the problem. The developer experience was fine overall, honestly, but over time I noticed two specific things I wish worked better. First, the way Taskmaster scopes tasks. It uses tags where you have separate buckets like a master tag or whatever custom ones you create on top. Switching between them never felt natural to me. It could be smoother. Second, the tasks themselves are stored in JSON files. You can absolutely read them in the terminal when you run the CLI commands, that part is fine. But opening the raw JSON in an editor and trying to skim through is not a pleasant experience. Both of those are fixable and neither is a deal breaker. The engine is solid, so the core tool still works. But you combine the commercial pivot, the license situation, the telemetry concern, and the slower release cadence, and you can see why the star growth stalled. It's an interesting case study in monetization timing. Taskmaster was growing well when the commercial pivot happened. 12 months from now, there'll probably be a blog post from somebody, a proper teardown, arguing either that the pivot saved the project or that it stalled it. Right now, based on the numbers, the stall side of that argument is winning. While the original 5 were busy rewriting themselves or going commercial, the space around them kept expanding. A couple of new projects have grown large enough that you can't really talk about spec-driven development in 2026 without mentioning them. Superpowers by Jesse Vincent. 156,000 stars, more than any single one of the 5 I just covered. Superpowers isn't strictly a spec-driven framework, it's an agentic skills system for Claude Code that enforces test-driven development and a structured brainstorm plan execute workflow. It's adjacent to SDD rather than squarely inside it, but it's the largest structured AI coding project on GitHub right now, and I use it personally daily alongside plan mode. When I have a big feature to plan, Superpowers asks many more questions than plan mode does. I already have a full video on Superpowers, link in the description, if you want a deeper walkthrough. GSD Get Shit Done by TACHES, 51,600 stars. This one is execution first. Wave-based parallel orchestration, fresh context windows for researchers and planners and executors, all coordinated by a top-level runtime. 47 releases since December. A different model from most of the leaderboard, GSD is more about running specs than writing them, with parallel agent context doing the actual work. Beats by Steve Yegge. 20,800 stars and the maintainer is still pushing commits. Last push was a couple of days ago. Bits is a distributed graph issue tracker for AI agents backed by Dolt, which is a version control SQL database. Their pitch is literally replaces messy markdown files with a dependency-aware graph. It sits in Taskmaster's category, task tracking and agent memory, but without the Commons Clause license and with a sharper thesis. A few of you have asked me to look at Beats. This is my brief flag. Interesting, I want to try it properly, it'll be its own video. And then there's the native feature side of the story, which is the thing that changed most quietly. Claude Code itself now ships with skills, plan mode, ultra plan mode, the last one is a newer addition, and Claude.md files for project level standards. A lot of what the smaller spec-driven frameworks were built to provide, planning structure, standards enforcement, multi-agent coordination, has been absorbed into the coding tool you're already running. That's part of why some of these frameworks are growing slower than you'd expect. The competition isn't other frameworks anymore, it's the tools they sit on top of. Visual Misor mapped more than 30 agentic coding frameworks in a March medium piece. The space is crowded. A lot of these projects won't make it through another 6 months. The ones that do will be the ones with strong communities or a clear reason to exist alongside the native features. Spec-driven development now has a Wikipedia page. It has 4 papers on archive, that's the open access preprint server Academics, used to publish research before formal peer review, 4 of them in the first quarter of this year alone. ThoughtWorks put SDD on their technology radar in the Access technology. 6 months ago, the idea was still something you argued about on X. Today, it's a topic for conference keynotes and enterprise rollouts. Martin Fowler wrote a long, cautiously skeptical analysis. He uses a German word for making things worse through attempted improvement, which I am not going to try to pronounce on camera. His bigger worry is that SDD reminds him of model-driven development. Quick context: model-driven development was a 19th movement where you draw diagrams and generate code from them, and it mostly didn't work out. His concern is that SDD makes the same promise. Write the spec, generate the code, and it might hit the same walls. His piece is the most coherent skeptical case I read on SDD so far. On the critical side, François Zaninotto from Marmelab wrote a piece back in November called Spec-Driven Development: The Waterfall Strikes Back, arguing SDD brings waterfall-era problems back in Markdown form. It hit Hacker News the same week. Marc Brooker from AWS wrote a direct rebuttal arguing that SDD gets you designing earlier and more iteratively rather than locking you into a big upfront design phase the way old-school waterfall did. The debate has shifted from is SDD a good idea to how do you do SDD well. On the enthusiast side, Prezi engineering ran 4 teams through SDD workflows. One engineer migrated an application to Material UI in 2 minutes, which they contrasted with another company where 7 front-end teams took 12 months to do a similar migration the old way. Those are 2 different apps and 2 different scopes, so the numbers don't translate directly, but the Prezi team treated it as proof SDD actually works at scale. That's the kind of anecdote that gets people to give SDD a try. 6 months of spec-driven development compressed. OpenSpec ran away with it, plus 863%, the fastest workflow of the 5, and the one I personally kept using the longest. Spec Kit grew on GitHub's brand as much as on its own merits. BMAD rewrote itself and kept its loyal community. Taskmaster stalled right as it tried to go commercial. Agent OS went quiet and narrowed its scope to the one job it does well. Around the edges, Superpowers GSD and Bits showed up, and Claude Code itself quietly absorbed a bunch of what these frameworks used to do. The headline: Spec-driven development is real now. It's not all winning, and some of it is being replaced by features shipping inside the tools you already use. New players keep appearing. This video is going to age badly, which is honestly the point of making it at all. A hands-on retest of the original 5 is on the list for a future video. If that's something you want, let me know in the comments. And one last thing. Every framework in this video is pitched as the right way to plan software with AI. My cat never writes a spec. She wakes up at 5 in the morning, sees the sun, and food appears. Fastest feedback loop I have ever seen.